welcome to the Election Show on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm your host, Dr. Christina Greer. I'm an associate professor of political science at Fordham University and the co-host of the FAQ NYC podcast. Joining me today, as always, via Zoom is Matt McDermott, communication strategist and vice president of Whitman Insight Strategies, and also with me is political analyst and professor of political science at Columbia University, Lincoln Mitchell. Hello, gentlemen. How are you?
Good to be with you.
All right.
We survived another 2 weeks in our democracy. We've got lots to talk about this week. I want to start with the convention, just because lots of folks are asking me questions about what's going to happen, how will we practice social distancing. So I guess I'll start with the Democrats, since their convention is first. They moved it from July to mid-August. So Matt, I'll start with you. Joe Biden recently announced that he's inviting former governor of Ohio, John Kasich, to participate in the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, and it's been met with some mixed reviews. Can I get your thoughts on having a former prominent Republican who's been pretty outspoken against President Trump? He's also been quite conservative when it comes to reproductive justice and also LGBTQ plus issues, environmental issues. He's not necessarily on brand for a progressive Democratic message. So what do you think of his invite?
Well, first I can say John Kasich is certainly not a progressive Democrat. I think we can all be confident in that. Clearly what the Biden campaign is doing here, which is smart for winning a national general election, is to make the case that, one, Joe Biden is obviously a Democrat going against Donald Trump, but therein, this is a bigger issue than a two-party political system, this election. We are running against a man who has corrupted our democracy. And so you see it in polling, you see it just, in people on the street conversations, you see in the media. There's clearly a cohort of Republicans who are dissatisfied with this president and want to see him out of office. And so I think the question's always been, will those Republicans who are dissatisfied with this president, who think he's corrupted our democracy, who think he has done illegal things in office, a la sort of, the Mitt Romneys of the world, will they actually stand up and say, it's not enough to just say, I don't support Donald Trump. I need to actually go into this election supporting the opposition candidate. And John Kasich has obviously made the decision that the only way to get Donald Trump out of office is to elect Joe Biden. Anyone, with half a brain can make that same conclusion. I guess the question for me is, will John Kasich be the only one? Or will we see other Republicans over the next month or two finally stepping up and saying, you know what, we can't do another 4 years of this, given what we've seen transpire over the last 4. So I think, heading into the convention, while we see those Republicans stand up, I think we as Democrats also need to keep in mind, which is particularly important for the left, the progressive left, those that supported Bernie Sanders, is you may not love Joe Biden as our nominee, but at the end of the day, if Joe Biden is elected president, he will be the most progressive president we've seen in our lifetimes in the history of this country. His agenda is more progressive than that of Barack Obama, certainly that of Bill Clinton a decade and a half ago. And so I think we need to just balance, our expectations here, where he'll certainly be elevating Republicans for the sake of winning this election. I think we as Democrats can be comforted in knowing the fact that this agenda that he's putting forth is the most progressive in American history.
So Lincoln, Matt just laid out, a pretty clear strategy of also getting weak-leaning Democrats, moderates, and also probably weak-leaning Republicans. This purity test that many progressive Democrats seem to have when it comes to Joe Biden has put him in a bit of a bind at certain times. Do you see this strategy possibly backfiring with the far left wing of the party?
Before I answer that, I just want to raise another couple of points about John Kasich in particular. Kasich is extremely popular in Ohio, where the Republican Party, as we speak, is in a pretty big crisis. So this is not just some governor. This is someone who could potentially bring Ohio back into play. If Biden wins Ohio, this election is over, full stop. So there is that side to it. Secondly, Kasich is not a Republican in name only. He's a very conservative Republican. So him speaking at this is really meaningful. To get to your question and my third point, the short answer is there's a term for people who run for office afraid of the extreme wing of their party. Those people are called losers, right? So as much as I may share some ideological simpatico with the people on the far left of the Democratic Party, If Biden allows them to dictate the tactics of this campaign, he will lose. And another thing that underlies that is that we are witnessing an interesting transformation here, a critically important one. The Biden campaign is no longer about a center-left candidate seeking to win the presidency, although that is certainly part of what's going on. It is becoming and growing into an omnibus pro-democracy coalition, which is the electoral strategy for overturning authoritarian governments. And we have to begin to think about this election in this context. Now, John Kasich is the highest profile individual name, but we have also seen the Lincoln Project, which is a collection of very conservative Republican strategists and operatives. And we have seen an organization called Republican Voters Against Trump, which mostly has an online presence, but is led by William Kristol, who is far from some kind of liberal Republican. So we are beginning to see this movement. For the future of American democracy, it is important to embrace it. The question that I would be asking, that I am asking, is what influence do these people expect to have? It's one thing to have, once Biden wins, it's one thing to have John Kasich speak at the convention. It's another thing to have him calling Joe Biden on the phone and saying, for example, that he can influence who gets appointed to the judiciary.
So I want to stay with you, Lincoln, because you mentioned the Lincoln Project, and I wanted to bring that up with you too. I mean, we've now started to see not just a coalition of Republican leaders from across the nation, we've also seen retired military personnel start to speak out. And these are people who normally sit on the sidelines. They obviously hold political views, but they tend to oftentimes not weigh in on the politics of particular policies that are going on, especially under a sitting president. So with this idea, I mean, I do want to follow up. I mean, is Biden painting himself in a corner in the sense that as he's building this multi-generational coalition with many Republicans from across the nation, retired and otherwise, and we know that there's quite a bit of diversity, ideological diversity within the Republican Party, is there a fear or a worry that these people will also have a seat at the table if they assist Joe Biden in getting elected?
Well, they may have a seat at the table. That's the unanswered question. We cannot go into this election afraid of that, because we have to have the confidence that, remember, the Congress, the House will still be run by Nancy Pelosi or someone to the left of her. And the Senate will either be run by Chuck Schumer or someone like that, or by Mitch McConnell. And if it's the latter, not a single meaningful piece of legislation will be passed, not a single judge will be confirmed. But if we take back the Senate, the Democrats take back the Senate, then who's whispering in Joe Biden's ear won't be all that important. However, the way to turn that notion into reality is for the left wing of the Democratic Party to be visible in this campaign. Right.
Matt, I want to follow up with you with the Lincoln Project. What do you think could be a scenario?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 2 points at play. One is you look at any policy platform of the Biden candidacy, take climate change, for instance. The climate change agenda for a Joe Biden presidency is the most aggressive that's ever been authored by any elected official running for higher office. And so appreciating that there are going to be independents and Republicans that are not only publicly supporting Joe Biden, but clearly in the case of the Lincoln Project, working at his behest to win this election. At the end of the day, the agenda that's being put forth is aggressively progressive. And I think the other thing I would add to that is, and we'll see if he holds true to this, and I certainly think progressive Democrats will have to hold Biden accountable were he to win. I think Biden has consistently made the case that he will use his cabinet to set forth the Democratic Party of the future. And so I read that to mean his cabinet will be made up of a younger generation, a more diverse generation, and a more diverse set of voices, including those on the left, so that even if Joe Biden is our president, I think there's an appreciation from him, first and foremost, that he's not the future of this party. And so I would expect that we would see, not only potentially in his vice presidential pick, but I think more importantly in his cabinet, a selection of individuals that represent the future of this party. And I think we would all agree the future of this party is further to the left than it's ever been in our recent history.
I'm also curious to see if he'll pull, say, a Justin Trudeau strategy and really make a commitment to have representation, especially gender equity within the cabinet. Justin Trudeau said he wanted to have a 50-50, especially since we know that in America, women are 51% of the nation. So it'll be interesting to see how he shapes that, especially as we think about all the women's names who've been floating around as potential VP candidates. There are obviously lots of positions for them in various endeavors. Okay, so Matt, I'll stick with you since you're nice and tan. Let's move to Florida. So we know that the Republicans have shifted their convention from North Carolina. I believe they're going to have the first day there, and then they will spend the remainder of the RNC convention in late August in Florida, Jacksonville, Florida, to be specific. We know that Florida has seen spikes in coronavirus related deaths, but also just infection rates. And we also know that the president has quite a few properties there and an investment in having people come to the state of Florida, even amidst this global pandemic. What do you think is going to happen in the sense that the Democrats have scaled back? They've gone from a massive convention in Milwaukee to a pretty sparse convention to essentially we're just going to have speakers, not really any delegates, definitely no guests, limited media, where the Republicans don't seem to want to follow that strategy. They're essentially saying, come one, come all, and we'll figure it out once you get here. Where do we go from there, knowing what we know about the spread of the coronavirus, especially in a state like Florida?
The fact that we're even having this conversation speaks to the absurdity of this administration at this point. You now have, we're what, 2 weeks out, 3 weeks out from tens of millions of families being told that their kids aren't able to go back into the schools this fall because we don't have the systems in place to ensure their safety. The idea that a major political party in this country would be holding an in-person convention overlapping that same timeline is just ludicrous. And I think we can all admit to that. I would suspect it's a lot of bluster. I do not imagine a situation in which there are thousands of people packed into a convention hall for the Republican convention. One, we would hope they'd all be wearing masks, and just the visual of that as a reflection on this president's tenure in office would be atrocious for him politically. And two, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, you see Democrats moving forward with an online convention because it's just a logical thing to do. We've all moved into an environment where we're doing things remotely. Case in point, this very show. And so it just makes sense that our political parties would align with the realities of the health situation we face. So we'll see how the Republicans decide to move ahead. But at the moment, it would frankly shock me to see them ultimately gather in person and not do some sort of remote event, appreciating the public health realities that we're facing right now.
Yeah, so Lincoln, I mean, building on what Matt has just stated, we know that the president last week wore a mask for the very first time in public, essentially roughly 100, it was 99 days since the coronavirus touched down in the United States. I mean, the visual of having thousands of people wearing masks would physically and symbolically show the failures of this particular administration. I mean, what do you think the Republicans can and should do as far as holding a convention? And we know that even after the Tulsa rally a few weeks ago that the president held, almost everyone who was there contracted coronavirus in varying degrees of severity. Many of them were not wearing a mask, but some were and still contracted the virus. So what do you think the Republicans should and could do moving forward?
Florida is an interesting case for this because one of the subtexts of why Florida is that there are at least 4 Republican politicians, Governor Santos, Senator Rubio, Senator Scott, and Congressman Matt Gaetz, who is one of the leading lights of kind of Trumpism in the House, who will all be exploring presidential campaigns in 2024, whether or not Trump gets reelected. So the Florida Republican politics are very complicated. Now, coming from today, saying we're going to do this, where Florida could be with the coronavirus by the time we get into late August, it could be so extreme that this is simply undoable. And I suspect that anybody who is capable of connected thought understands that. Now, that is a category that precludes the president. And this seems to be one of those many decisions that are made in the White House based on what gets Trump happy today. What stops Donald Trump from having a tantrum today? It's a bad way to govern. It's a bad way to craft campaign strategy. The visual here will either be lots of people in masks with Trump saying that wearing a mask is patriotic, and I was the first person to say we should wear masks, or it will be a half-empty convention.
And it's so interesting how the president can just say something out of thin air, and not only do reporters believe it, but the media also follows along. So Lincoln, I'll stick with you because the president has now decided that he's going to reinstate his daily coronavirus briefings. We have seen that Dr. Anthony Fauci has been sidelined. We have not seen him as part of the administration's sort of communication strategy at all. We know the president has some negative thoughts about Dr. Fauci, possibly because of his popularity. But the president is going to come back and speak to the nation, even though his advisors advised him against it, largely because they saw the poll numbers going down when he had essentially these rambling fits. Now, because the doctors have essentially been sidelined and the scientists have been sidelined, these are threatening to be just campaign rallies each day with very little information or facts about what is actually going on. What's the cost-benefit analysis of the president coming before the American people every day for a campaign rally / ramble session?
That is an apt description. Where I would want to clarify is it's a campaign rally for Joe Biden. This race could be a lot closer. This race isn't over yet. The polls are certainly looking good for Biden, but it's not over yet. But the strategy to make this race closer means less of Trump, more smart messaging. But instead, because of Trump's need to be happy in the moment, because of his need, his deep-seated and completely ungrounded belief that he uniquely can make things better, he believes the best thing for Donald Trump is to go out there and ramble for half an hour. That's clearly not the case. It is a strategy that will keep the base excited. And because Trump most likely in a free and fair election is going to lose, keeping that base excited is really essential for his post-election strategy, of which we've seen a teaser the last few days in Portland. But in terms of persuading new voters, as an individual candidate, Trump simply isn't capable of doing that, and this campaign rallies or press conferences or ramble sessions, if you will, are not going to be an exception.
Right. So Matt, I mean, what do we think about these essentially free PR sessions that the president is given by the media? They cover them extensively. We started to see the media switching off every now and again when it veered into just flat out lies, but not all media outlets did that. So he's using this in prime time to speak to the American public, but this is also the first time we've seen a presidential candidate who doesn't seem very interested in expanding his base in these briefings and ramble sessions. So what are your thoughts?
Look, I've been a vocal opponent of our media institutions in this country shutting the mic and shutting the camera on Donald Trump when he does these diatribes, because they're just, one, they're not healthy for media. They're not healthy for news flow. They're not healthy for our democracy. There is no asset to having a president in this mental state rambling to the American people about whatever's on his mind. That said, I agree with Lincoln completely. I mean, it's only been to the benefit of Joe Biden that he's been afforded the opportunity to go on camera and have these sessions. And the number that I just have in the back of my mind in this conversation is 75%. 6 months ago, most Americans thought the country was headed in the right direction. They thought the economy was strong. They thought unemployment was at record lows. They could overcome their concerns about this president with where the country was headed. Currently, 75% of voters in this country think America's headed in the wrong direction. That's not just Democrats. That's not just, independents who are disaffiliated with this president. That includes Republicans. And so there's an increasing majority in this country who's tired of the direction we're going on. And it's evident that Donald Trump is the reason for that direction, whether it's the public health crisis, whether it's the economic collapse we faced, whether it's the continued massive unemployment we have. And so overwhelmingly, this country thinks we're headed in the wrong direction. And there's one person to blame for that, Donald Trump. And so if he wants to go on TV every day between now and the election and make his case to voters, frankly, I'm fine with it because his case is nutty. There's no solution to the single biggest thing that is affecting our country right now, which is the global pandemic. There's no solution for how to get our kids back into school. There's no solution for how we can safely reopen our stores and our economy. There's no solution how we can get people back to work. And so we'll see what he has to say, but it's not to his benefit to date, at least.
But Matt, I want to push back on this 75%. 75% of Americans who say the country's going in the wrong direction, because it seems like the president's new strategy will be law and order, right? Everything's so dangerous. We've seen he started to run ads about elderly white women being attacked essentially by Black America. And so as we see the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, a multi-ethnic, multi-generational coalition of Americans of all stripes, right? We were seeing LGBTQ plus groups merging with BLM. We're seeing DACA groups merging with BLM. So we're seeing these cross-cutting cleavages. But the president seems to now want to double down on law and order as a strategy, since, as you rightly pointed out, he can't talk about coronavirus, he can't talk about employment, he can't talk about schools. Do you think, though, that some of those 75% of Americans who are saying the country's going in the wrong direction, they may be thinking about this boogeyman, this fear that they're seeing on their screens at night, you know, cities being taken over by radical extremists, as the president calls them? And will the president be able to chip away at some weak-leaning Democrats, some moderates and independents who overtly are possibly disgusted by certain policies of the president and also his behavior, but secretly are a little worried about their own safety, personal safety? You know, we hear it on NPR quite a bit when people call in and say, I support BLM, but I'm also worried about, and many times unfounded fears, because they don't live in communities that are even remotely touched by some of the uprisings. So do you think that some of those people are in those numbers? And if so, will the president's law and order strategy start to chip away at their confidence in, say, a Biden multi-ethnic coalition, and how he's talked about rethinking incarceration, rethinking police enforcement, and coalition building, especially with centering anti-Black racism and undoing some of those wrongs?
No. And I say that because, I hate to say it so bluntly, but this has been the election strategy for Republicans for decades now. And Donald Trump has maximized it to the extreme, whether it's, Mexicans, running towards the border ahead of the midterm election, whether it was M15 or M16, I forget what drug cartel it even was, that was taking over our suburbs ahead of 2018. And now it's this idea that, protesters against systemic racism in Portland are going to, flock to our suburbs and attack our families. It's ludicrous. And I think by using the same fear tactic, the same boogeyman over and over again, it's lost its efficacy, in part because the single biggest threat to the American voter in their minds is the president of the United States. And so it's just not an effective message for him. By a 20-point margin in our polling, voters trust Joe Biden over Donald Trump to keep their family safe, to keep their community safe. And so the idea that Donald Trump, the single biggest threat to our way of living, to our democracy, to the future of our next generation, is somehow going to come out and use a message of law and order against the American people, it's not going to be effective. We've seen it lose its efficacy from the 28 midterm on through today. And so it's obviously his strategy. It's obviously where he's most comfortable communicating with the American people. It's just not going to work for him.
Lincoln, what do you think about this strategy and the idea of law and order as a central focus that the president has to hold on to now, because he can't focus on the economy or the health of the citizenry?
We should also specify that it's not COVID that has hurt Donald Trump's presidency. It's his murderous mishandling of the crisis that has hurt his presidency. Otherwise, it would just be some outside thing that he could talk about. The problem with now, and also, Trump's not going to lose this election 70-30. He's going to get 43 to 46% of the vote. And Biden probably will get more than that. But he's not going to get 25%. So it will bring some voters in. Fundamentally, the problem Trump has here is that law and order strategies work in one of two situations. One, when you're a challenger and you say there's chaos on the streets because of the incumbent. And two, when there is no chaos on the streets and you're saying the challenger will cause chaos on the streets, right? But when you are in office and there is chaos on the streets, people blame you. I keep going back to what Richard Daley accidentally said at the 1968 Democratic Convention when there were essentially police riots on the streets of Chicago. And he said, the police are not here to create disorder, they are here to preserve disorder. And right now, Donald Trump may not be creating disorder, but he is definitely preserving it. And those videos of stormtroopers, and I don't use that word lightly, but stormtroopers, security forces, federal security forces, whose provenance is not entirely known, on the streets of Portland, and we will soon see it in other American cities. That is not law and order. That is totalitarianism, and most Americans know that.
Right. And Lincoln, I mean, in the last 1 or 2 minutes, I want to just get both of your thoughts. You have essentially been ringing this alarm since we started this show together. Essentially, your concerns about the president using voter suppression and voter disenfranchisement to actually win the election. So as Matt talks about some of the robust polling that has been conducted, we always have to keep in mind the theft that is always in the shadows. So closing thoughts really briefly. I just want to say the president tweeted out wishing Ghislaine Maxwell well. She is possibly the counterpart to Jeffrey Epstein. And so she is now in custody. Is that another distraction tactic, really briefly, Matt? Or do you think that the president genuinely cares about Ghislaine? Or is he signaling, just as he did with Roger Stone, that if she is good to him, he will protect her and possibly pardon her the same way he did Roger Stone?
Yeah, this is the president's inability to understand political headwinds that's been consistent through his presidency. And so it's no surprise that he continues to do things that are just beyond politically disadvantageous for his reelection effort.
Right. And so, Lincoln, do you think that he'll be, A, penalized for pardoning Roger Stone, or do you think that Americans will forget about it by November? And also, what is this tweet to Ghislaine Maxwell signal for you?
I want to maybe pivot away from that for a second, because I think these are both stories that the American people will be so overwhelmed with other stories that they will forget. Although, Trump it signals his complicity. In February of 2017, when I first wrote Donald Trump will not leave office if he loses, I was dismissed left, right, and center as a nut. Today, that is boring, conventional wisdom. And that is what we must, that remains a central focus here. Trump told Chris Wallace in that Fox News interview that he won't accept the outcome of this election. We must recognize that. He has told us what he is doing. Portland is a dress rehearsal for this, and we must be prepared for that.
Right. Well, keep in mind, he said in 2016 that if he assumed that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and he signaled then that he would not accept necessarily the election results. Since we last met, Congressman John Lewis passed away from the great state of Georgia. Any brief reflections, Matt and Lincoln, on the passing of such a civil rights icon and what it means for this moment?
I'll just say, I mean, given his passing, but also given just what our democracy is facing right now, Democrats would be wise when they regain Congress to immediately adopt a democracy reform package, including restating the Voting Rights Act in his honor and in his legacy, not only for his passing, but moving forward as a democracy, strengthening the institutions that have been eroded under this president.
Lincoln, really briefly?
John Lewis was a force for moral rightness in the United States. And the proof of that is Republicans who worked their whole lives to oppose him on the day of his death recognized what a great moral leader he was. The Republicans know they're wrong, and they know they're on the wrong side of history and morality, and John Lewis is on the right side.
Well, we definitely lost a giant, and hopefully the Democrats will be able to have some bipartisan leadership on both sides of the aisle to honor his legacy. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Hopefully next week we can talk more about some of Joe Biden's robust policies when it comes to education and debt relief and housing assistance that he's put forward. So thank you all again for joining us. This is all the time we have. I want to thank my two guests / co-hosts. I'm Dr. Christina Greer, and I want to thank Matt McDermott and Lincoln Mitchell. You've been watching the election show on MNN. Thank you so much for tuning in.